Perfect. Okay, apologies for the delay. So this lunchtime we're going to be talking about side projects, um, and with a particular sort of emphasis on learning, growing, and showcasing your skills. Feel free to ask me questions as we go. I can't see the chat, so just shout or pop something in the actual chat, and then either Alex or Charlotte can shout at me. Um, so, um, who am I? Why do I feel I have any authority to speak about this? I'm a software engineer and engineering leader who've been doing software since the mid 90s. And I have run a number of teams and done a number of roles, and I'm very curious. So I feel kind of that combination of things. Um, I also am someone who does side projects. I think they are a useful thing. I like to keep on learning. So, and in particular, over the last year, I've been doing more side projects and found them to be super beneficial. And the sort of Scottish Tech Army struck me as the kind of folks who are already doing side projects in terms of the volunteering work you're doing. And that should be strongly encouraged. But perhaps there's an opportunity to be a bit more deliberate about what you're picking and so on. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about what I mean by side projects. Hopefully, it matches with what you're expecting to talk about. But if not, let's get that out of the way, sort of front. Why? Why not? How to pick them? I'm going to go through a few examples of side projects that I've done in the last couple of years that were beneficial to me. And then sort of we're going to touch a little bit on other other paths for learning, as I see sort of learning as the sort of primary focus around sort of side projects from an individual's perspective. I put the obligatory question slide at the end, but as I said, feel free to ask me questions as we go. I put a definition up as to what I think side projects might entail. And you can all read it. You're probably all reading it as I'm talking, because that's how Zoom works. But we're going to kind of dig into this definition and break it up to kind of look at each individual sort of component. The first thing I think is super important about side projects is they are a place that is sort of psychologically safe for you to explore and learn and develop your skills. And that's important whether you're doing a side project for yourself or whether you're doing it in some sort of organizational context. Why is that sort of important? Why have I put that as the first thing? For me, side projects are about learning how to ignore all of the noise in social media and in the education system about the sort of failing and making mistakes. So when I undertake a side project, the main thing I want to do most is fail, because that teaches me where the boundaries are and where I can learn and where I can change my own understanding and get better. They need to be, if you're undertaking a side project in the workplace, then that psychological safety is really, really important, because you want diverse voices, you want opinions that are different from how you would normally undertake work. So you might want to ignore a whole bunch of processes because what you're doing is not a project that is going to go in the state you're doing it into a production environment. So does it need all of the monitoring, all of the observability, all of the security, all of the everything else that is wrapped up in how you normally build product? It also needs to be a place where you can challenge assumptions in terms of this is how we've always done this. No one can build, no one can train an AI model without it costing £100 million. As those of you who will have seen, that's obviously been sort of challenged quite dramatically recently. Um, and we'll talk about sort of the kind of conditions that make that kind of challenge interesting. Um, they should be learning experiments. And by what I mean is for me, I need to have a learning outcome and ideally a hypothesis that centers where I want to spend my energy on a side project. Like most of you, I have other pressures on my time. I have, a day job. I have kids. I have a dog that needs to be walked 3 times a day. That doesn't give me vast amounts of time to work on side projects. And so when I am spending that time, I want to be spending it sort of usefully. Um, I put down a way which I feel is helpful to express a hypothesis. This is taken from other work by ThoughtWorks, I believe, that talks about like what we're going to try and build, what we hope will happen as a result, and how we're going to measure whether that hope has been realized. Um, but I also want to just pull out what I'm talking about here by sort of learner-centered learning or active learning. Um, People tend to learn in a number of different ways. Some people by um, are more visual learners, some are more textual, but also how you're learning is super important in terms of understanding and getting the most from that learning experience. So um, the education system is focused a lot around sort of passive learning. So sit in a classroom, sit in a workshop, attend a webinar, and listen to some bearded fellow tell you about stuff. And that's all very passive. Um, and so you are consuming the words that I'm speaking. Um, Active learning is where you're much more engaged in the process by building that piece of software, configuring that cloud platform, writing more interesting tests, however it might be. Um, Constraints are one way in which you can take something that you already know and challenge that. Either building a website, but giving yourself a performance budget of 100 milliseconds. So you know how to build a website, as in the example, but can you ensure that every page that's being served is served under that time? That forces you to think about things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Building a website, but not using any JavaScript. That's another sort of constraint that will get you to think about that particular problem in a different way. As I already mentioned, this is also an opportunity to discard the constraints that you normally work under. Everything I work on must have a JIRA ticket that must be expressed in this way and have been approved by 17 people. Is a kind of constraint that you might want to discard when you're working on a side project. Or it might be the kind of constraint you want to introduce because normally, you're working in an environment which is a lot of chaos and you're having to distill all of that user kind of feedback and working out how to write a good set of requirements might be the thing you're learning. So constraints are really, really helpful, but being deliberate about them and about which you include and which you don't. Designed to shorten feedback cycles. So I've worked in organizations where the feedback cycle has been months or years, and where the feedback cycle has been sort of days, and typically not faster than that. I've worked mostly in sort of B2B, so I haven't had that sort of large volume of user feedback where you can push something and ruin everyone's lives because they can't now see their social media or what have you. So for me, side projects are about working with an accelerated feedback cycle. And why is that important? Because we learn through feedback. So designing your hypothesis, designing your sort of outcome so that you can make that feedback cycle as quick as possible and accelerate your learning. There are ways to do that. Time boxing is one. Giving yourself a deadline that doesn't have the sort of psychological pressure of a work deadline, because it's not got a deliverable that's sort of accountable, but that says, I will only spend this amount of time, or I need to demonstrate this to another person in 2 days' time, or something like that. And that really helps pare down what it is you're trying to demonstrate. So we spoke earlier about sort of constraints and the sort of outcomes you're after, and being able to say, I need to demonstrate this one thing, but I don't care about the rest of the UI or all the sort of usual thing I would need to build here. But I do need to demonstrate this one thing. And in that particular example is really helpful when you're trying to de-risk future efforts. So you might work in an environment where you are used to delivering every 3 months, and you want to understand if that particular project is going to succeed or fail before you get to that 3 month point. So you might choose, as an organization, we want to do this one thing in 3 days to understand if we can achieve this thing in 3 months. So we are going to re-platform our technology. We're going to, instead of using WordPress, we're going to use Astro as our website technology. How do I understand if that's going to work? Well, can I get something that is deployable if deployment is your problem? Or can I get something that enables me to take content from the place I normally take content? Don't care about the look and feel, don't care about the navigation, but can I get the content? Because if I can't, and if that's going to take me 2 months out of the 3 months, then I won't succeed. Finally, in terms of my very long-winded definition, side projects aren't side of desk necessarily. They can be something that you do in your spare time as an individual, but they can also be something that you in your organization do as a means of having these learning opportunities, and a means to build workspace culture, to encourage you to work with people in other parts of the organization that you wouldn't necessarily normally work with, or to reconnect with colleagues and or potential future colleagues by the kind of volunteering side projects that the Scottish Tech Army runs. I don't have much else to say on that. Just it's not just developers on their own in their basement building stuff. Why bother? So the first, and I said the primary reason, I think, is about learning. And there are two aspects of that learning. One is you should be, or it is typical in my experience, that you do not know all of the things you need to know when you first get a role. And so you need to understand some of the tech stack, some of the approach, some of the ways of working, and so on. And the side project is a way of doing that. But it's also true that the roles you take on won't necessarily be the same role you want to do next. A lot of roles are stepping stones. A lot of roles are different to how they're described on the jobs advert. And in order to get the next role, the next more interesting thing, you will need to practice skills that you're not going to pick up by doing the role you're doing. And so learning for that role, I think is an important sort of thing that side projects can do. They're also an opportunity to kind of become T-shaped or pie-shaped, which the astute amongst you will have spotted on the author slide at the front. A T-shaped individual is someone who has a broad set of skills quite shallowly and an area of deep skills. And most tech people start off by being I-shaped people. So they start off being an expert in one particular area. And I've just realized, apologies, that I've had my camera off all the time. And if I can work out how to do that, then I will do that. Apologies. I've been very effusive and you haven't been able to see who I am. So yeah, people start off being I-shaped, an expert as a developer. And typically, as they progress as a developer, they will develop adjacent skills. So they'll start to understand a little bit about what a tester does, or an SRE, or a support analyst, or a security analyst, or something like that. And then they may, in time, develop a second or third area of expertise, become pie-shaped or cone-shaped or whatever. And even within that sort of deep area of expertise, getting more familiar with a particular concept or framework or language and so on. So one of the side projects that I did last year was about learning a new programming language. Not because it was going to be useful for any particular role, but because concepts and languages and frameworks teach you patterns about how you might perceive the world. And so for me, it was about this particular language was deliberately simplifying some things, and that was interesting to sort of work within those constraints, but also to understand like how that was changing how engineers built stuff. When might you not want to do a side project, or when might you want to stop doing one? If there's no learning opportunity, or if you stopped learning, if it's just toil, that's not a side project. That's just your day job. Is there anything else I want to say? Probably not. Okay. How to pick a helpful side project? I would say work out what you want to get from it. And that can be really hard, particularly if you're earlier in your career. There's a couple of links which I've included here, which I will send out after the session. One is to roadmap.sh, which is a set of skills and an ordering of skills if you want to become a front-end developer, or become a data scientist, or become a game dev, or any of those kind of pathways. And so if you don't know what to learn next, then those kinds of tools can help suggest things that other people, other professionals might expect you to know, or things that are generally helpful to you to learn in your next stage in your career. If you're building something, then I would encourage you to build real software. And sometimes kind of you've not got anything particular that is an itch that you want to scratch. And so something like codingchallenges.fyi is a useful set of defined and scoped side projects that are intended to teach you something about different things. So there's a very good sort of set of things there, like re-implementing certain Unix commands or building something that demonstrates a particular pattern. Generally, with side projects, I try and have a number of outcomes. So I want something very specific I'm going to learn. I want something that is going to be a very solid outcome. I prefer sort of creating something real rather than um, something that is not going to be useful to me, let alone anyone else. Um, which leads me on to talking about a few of the things that I've chosen to do as side projects. Um, for this bit in particular, I'm going to reiterate, please stop and ask me questions. These are things that I've obviously spent some energy on. And so I may forget to say something obvious about them. I picked a few examples to give you sort of a range of different types of thing, but I can talk about other particular examples, and I might do that given some of what I saw in the chat at the start. Um, so, dot files. I hate rebuilding my workstation, or I used to, and I really hated when I was CTO at a fintech onboarding a new engineer because it always took a week or two to get their machine to the point where they could actually meaningfully do anything. And it was really painful. And it every time we changed something in the environment, the instructions that we'd used before were like just slightly wrong. And so we at the time looked at a bunch of different approaches. Um, and we had one of the team build something interesting. And then I moved on from that role. And then my machine died and I had to rebuild it. So that was a very kind of useful moment to sort of think, am I going to spend a week rebuilding this machine, or am I going to spend a few days rebuilding it so I never have to rebuild it again? So what was I trying to achieve apart from getting my machine working again? I wanted to actually understand all the things and get rid of the things that I didn't need anymore. So understand what everything was and why it was in place, and to be able to rebuild the machine quickly if I needed to, um, so that I didn't have to ever go through that again. Um, I I ended up exploring some different approaches that other people have made. I used a bunch of tools because I stand on the shoulder of giants, and I'm lazy, which is good. Um, and I also kind of looked at some of the things that my team had used before and ultimately discarded them. So I tried to make sure I understood the reasons that were there in place. So there is a repo there. If you are running a Mac and want to steal any of that, please feel free. There was a few kind of interesting choices that I had to make as I was going through in terms of getting technology that worked together, not going down rabbit holes in terms of things that were on the surface kind of like cool, but ultimately I wasn't going to use or I wasn't using usefully. Um, I thought about like, what am I going to be doing in my development time? What are the tools I want to use? What are um, the tools I'm not going to use anymore? So um, that was a really interesting experiment. That was a few days over a week or two, and that's something that now I keep up to date. So when I install software, for example, I stick it on my package list and I run a couple of commands, and that's installed, but also it's installed for next time. As you can tell, I have Zoom on the machine, but I don't use it very often for presenting. Hence why the first 3 minutes of this is me struggling to work out how to set it up. This is something I wrote last week. So the problem is I own a number of domains that I'm not using at the moment. Um, I am I have spent my career kind of on that boundary between engineering and security, and so I have opinions about how to not have other people abusing the domains I have. Partly that's because I might want to use them in the future, partly because I'm generally not a fan of bad actors. Um, and DNS is one of those tricky things. Um, so this was some ended up some research I'd been kind of doing over the past um, few months with Nick, who's joined the call to keep me honest. And this was about kind of taking some of the learnings that we'd had and turning it into something that I could reproduce and run across my own park domains. Um, and so that was one of the outcomes. The second outcome was I'd never published a Terraform module, and I might want to do it in the future. And so this was a very small um, piece of Terraform that I could write, and I could understand the process of publication. So, so there is a Terraform module that exists. It's not very big. It's not very clever, but it enabled me to sort of push at a few of those sort of bits around the actual problem I was trying to solve. So it looks at how do I validate stuff? What kind of strictness do I want in terms of how people can use the module? And you know brought me back up to speed in terms of the tool set I was using. Um, this is a much bigger side project. So Clyde is a SaaS tool that allows you to run OS query against machines in your fleet. So they have a very nice set of tools that enable you to look at, you know, are things up to date? Do you have any bad configurations in place? And it's a very sophisticated tool. But one of the things it didn't have was the ability to sort of look at what was installed on my machine and compare it, for example, with vulnerability data. Whereas another tool I use, SteamPipe, which is an open source tool that allows you to effectively run queries against a variety of different things. That had the vulnerability data, but that didn't have any kind of plug-in to OS Query or Clyde or anything. So I thought, how hard can it be? I will write a plugin that I can connect this one tool I'm using with this other tool I'm using, and we'll be good. So I started digging into how SteamPipe allows you to do that, and discovered it was all written in Go, which I didn't know. So so I decided I would learn Go, and this was as I said a little while ago, I enjoy kind of making my side projects work and having multiple kind of useful outcomes. So I thought, well, if I have to learn Go, I will also want to understand, like, can I get ChatGPT to teach me to Go, or you know, some of these other AI tools. So I had a few different sort of outcomes I was looking at. So I wrote some Go with ChatGPT and a bunch of other robots, and I got it working. And then I got interviewed by a childhood sort of software hero of mine, which was a very strange experience, but very cool. And there are a few organizations who are using this plugin because they happen to be using Clyde and they happen to use SteamPipe. And it's kind of turned into a series of learning opportunities. So, you know, understanding how to unit test a command line script, for example. Alex, you had a question.
Hello, yeah, it's actually unfortunately for Andrew who just left, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And it relates to what you've just been saying. And the question is, what's been your biggest eureka moment arising from any project that you've ever done?
Um, I think most side projects have had their own eureka moment. So with this particular one, it was um, going from not knowing anything in Go to writing reasonably sophisticated code using sort of common patterns and sort of more interesting techniques like reflection. Um, that was like that was the eureka moment for this project. It was, you know, how obvious the learning is, because you've got that fast feedback loop. For a side project I did when I was working for a bank a number of years ago, it was the eureka moment was kind of showing the CEO at the time, um, of the wealth management business. Um, this is what we've been able to do in a couple of weeks against a project that you've been running for a couple of years, and we can demonstrate at this point our approach is better. And it wasn't a conversation of like, trust me, I'm an engineer. It was a conversation which was, here is a working example that doesn't do everything, but it does this one thing and demonstrates that like all of the objections you might have were, not objections enough. So that particular side project, we ended up rebuilding an entire platform, because we could demonstrate and de-risk. And that was the eureka moment for that. It was like, I have a hypothesis, I can demonstrate it, and people believe it because there's data to back it up.
Amazing. Thank you.
Um, which is a perfect timing to talk about what's worked and what hasn't. Um, so so for me, working out what I want to get out of it, and how I want to approach it, is the first thing. So what are the constraints? What are the things that I don't care about? And then the main thing is showing up. So all of the examples I've shown you, there are multiple small commits. Normally, when I get insomnia and have an hour or two I can spend on a side project, but it's about just keeping on plugging away and learning a little bit more, contributing a little bit more, and so on. I think building in the open has been a very strong thing. Firstly, because I have a good set of friends and colleagues who encourage me, and that's always helpful. But also, people who I can be accountable to, or who can like tell me when I'm doing something that's um, not worked for them and why it hasn't. And that's a learning opportunity. And it might be that my context is different and it works for me, and it might be that that's a rabbit hole I need to back out of. Writing and talking about it. So, know, putting side projects on your resume, on your LinkedIn, um, getting random strangers feedback on what you've done and why is super helpful. Um, and I think finally being meta about it. So like the writing the talk and talking now has been a useful mechanism to reflect about like how I do side projects, and um, how I make side projects work for me and how they don't. And I wouldn't have necessarily had all of that reflection if I hadn't said to Alex and Charlotte, like, yeah, I'll do this talk. Um, There are some other approaches um, in terms of picking up skills and improving yourself and demonstrating, showcasing what you're doing. Side projects won't work for everyone. There is an awesome book by O'Reilly about understanding how you learn called Apprenticeship Patterns. It's been out of print for a while, but you can still get it digitally or on Amazon. Other bookstores do exist. Contributing to other people's code in like small, sensible ways is another way of getting those skills practically. Blogging and writing about particular problems and so on could be considered a side project, but it could also be considered just a way of reflecting back. And then sort of doing code katas or sort of leak code and so on is probably the one I'd least encourage. It's good for building sort of muscle around that kind of thing, but uh, the kind of problem you're trying to solve. Whereas I think a lot of folks encounter like novel problems that need them to think about how they're going to approach stuff. Um, that's all, folks, unless you have questions.
There is one in the chat that I'll just mention now. So Bale's asked, how effective are side projects in gaining credibility and getting into a new field in tech? Are they a potential differentiator that recruiters look at?
Yes and no. So I would say recruiters may or may not have the sort of technical context to understand your side project. That might be good in that you can put some keywords on your resume and that gets you sort of past that screening. Or that might be bad in that they don't understand how it's relevant to a role. However, once you're past the recruiter, I think side projects are a really strong way to demonstrate to a hiring manager you care about your learning, you're curious, you can articulate something real that you have built, particularly if you're earlier in your career, and you may not have as broad a set of examples of real world problems that you've solved in the context of employment. Having side projects where you can demonstrate those skills, those same skills, allows you to potentially really differentiate yourself from other candidates who've not done that. So in that case, I think they can be super useful. Um, was there a first part of the question as well? Have I covered everything there?
You mainly have the first part was about um, gaining credibility, which I feel like you've covered, but then getting into a new field in tech, whether they're useful for that as
Yeah.
well.
So in terms of a new field, I would have said um, yes. Um, I don't have any specific examples to back that up, so that's gut feel. Um, but I think if you have done the work in a side project for the field that you're not currently operating in, then you've got that same experience. You can if you're an engineer and you're going for a testing role, and you can talk about the difference between testing and checks, or you can talk about exploratory testing, or you can um, talk about why you've decided to approach things in a particular way. Then I think that's you've got a stronger chance than someone who's not not done that.
Brilliant. And Bale said you've done justice to the question, so thank you.
Cool.
Ben actually has mentioned that he has a related question. So if you're up for it, Ben, just shout it out.
Yeah, so for me, like I never have problems coming up with ideas for side projects. And I end up having like lots of kind of different side projects that I'll kind of start working on and then kind of leave. And I kind of have this kind of, I don't know, like this fear of like having kind of like a whole bunch of like abandoned projects up on my GitHub and that it looks kind of bad that they're not complete. And like I have this kind of anxiety that I should be completing them. And I guess that mainly stems from because I feel like it looks bad in terms of like potential employers if they kind of see these kind of incomplete things. I mean, is that something I should worry about or not? Should I just be, like, I don't know, or like even if I'm starting a project, like um I kind of get concerned. It's like, oh, if I'm doing this and I'm doing it the wrong way, I'm putting it out in the open and kind of showing that I'm doing it wrong. And, like, should I be concerned about that or should I just kind of not? I don't know.
So, um, there's a few questions in there. I guess
Sorry, yeah.
should you be afraid? No. Very fundamentally, no. Um, if you've got a hiring manager who is interested enough in you as a candidate that they're checking out your GitHub and making sort of meaningful assessment of the code you've written, you're already ahead of the game. If you can demonstrate that you're learning, you're already ahead of the game. If you've got a whole wealth of different things that you've tried, you're already ahead of the game. Two things I might suggest though. One is um, on those abandoned projects, take an opportunity to reflect. So that could be as simple as updating the README on the project with like, here's what I set out to learn, here's what I learned, here's why this project is left at this particular point because I've learned the thing I needed to and I don't want to spend any more energy on it right now. Um, and then the second thing would be, if you can, try and use constraints to sort of really scope down what you're trying with those projects so that there is a very short window to say, do I want to spend any more time on this? I've done a little bit. I've answered my original question. I have 17 million other questions to ask, but do I want to spend time on any of them?
Yeah, that's useful feedback. Thanks.
Um, are there other questions? If not, then Nick. So the question is, in the recruiting war that is happening between AI generated CVs and AI powered recruiters, are side projects a good way to make connections with real people? Yes. Scottish Tech Army and the volunteering projects are a classic example of that. But any well contributed sort of open source project is going to be similar. There are people that you get to work with there who are equally passionate about the thing you've chosen to be passionate about. If your own side projects become successful and people become passionate about that, then again, they're the same people who have the same sort of itch or the same kind of problem. Yes, definitely. So Eleanor, very interesting question about would you talk about failed projects to recruiters or would you rather showcase a success? And to pick up, I guess, some of the language that Ben was using when he was asking his question earlier. None of your side projects are failures. They are experiments, and sometimes the result of the experiment is that you have demonstrated that the approach you looked at wasn't the right one. That framing is so important. There's a quote that I'm going to mangle about Thomas Edison and light bulbs that I'm sure some of you have heard before. Thomas Edison didn't create the light bulb. He did, but he also understood the 10,000 ways in which creating the light bulb could fail. And so he created a light bulb with a very strong understanding about what was important in making a light bulb. Side projects that where the experiment is not what you expect, what people would call a failure. It's not, and this is what I was talking about earlier about like the way that everyone sort of frames success and failure. Like the side project is a success, whether it demonstrates a failed outcome or a succeeding outcome. The fact that you've done it, you've articulated the question, you've found a way to evaluate your hypothesis, and you've understood enough to know what the outcome means. This is all success. And I don't know if you'd be having that conversation with a recruiter, but it should be a conversation that you can have with a hiring manager where you can say, here's the thing I tried, here's the stuff I learned off the back of it. And I'd very much try and reframe that thinking.
So I guess that it's really crucial then to make sure that at the end of your side project you have enough time to reflect on it and get those thoughts on the page while you remember them, so that you are having that time to reflect, because often these side projects, like you were saying, they're kind of squeezed into your little bits of time around your children or your dogs or whatever, and so having that time to kind of reflect is part of the project, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. So I spoke a little bit about sort of the meta learning about making sure you have time for active learning, making sure you have time for reflection. That's as much part of doing the side project as writing the code or doing the UX or whatever the flavor of your side project is. I don't know if there are any other questions, but I just wanted to call out a couple of things. So I've spoken very much about building software because that's what I do. That is not the only kind of side projects that you should be thinking about. You should be thinking about the side projects that are pertinent to the role you're in or the role that you want to be in. So a lo-fi wireframe is just as valid a side project. A articulation of a set of test cases against a website is just as valid a side project, because those things are helping you understand the act of testing or the act of designing a form or what have you. So from my recollection an hour ago of the kind of roles that people were doing, I know there was a couple of data scientists and sort of user experience folk. So I would probably point you at tools like evidence.dev, which is a way of, or observable, or Jupyter notebooks and things like that, a way of getting all the other fluff out of the way so you can focus on asking questions in that domain. For user experience, it might be about designing how you're going to interrogate data you're collecting. So for looking at a tool like Posthog or Segment and how you're going to ask questions of that data set. Or it might be about the kind of things that you want to change, the kind of A/B tests you want to run, the kind of conditions that you think are important and things like that. And there are always developers whose own side projects or open source and stuff would strongly benefit from those other disciplines, and are crying out for some of that.